Cornell University is in the process of building a fine arts library in an old early 20th century building called Rand Hall. In doing so, they are violating many basic fire safety principles in the New York State Building Code. Their latest ploy, supported by the City of Ithaca Building Department, what they call the Building Division, is to define a fifth-floor occupied open-air roof gallery as a so-called mezzanine. Since a mezzanine doesn't count as a story, the idea is to pretend that the new construction is for a four-story rather than a five-story building. In that way, they hope to get around the fact that they aren't allowed to put assembly-type occupancies on the fifth floor of this building. But before getting into the absolute insanity of their mezzanine claim, let me give you a quick history of all the building code variances that Cornell has obtained. 10 years ago, the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell had a bunch of freestanding buildings on the northern edge of the Art Squad, with various types of construction, ranging from the 5B construction type for Sibley Hall, basically non-fireproofed wood frame construction with the least possible fire resistance, to Rand Hall, with only marginally better non-fireproofed steel frame construction. The reason that the steel building is only slightly better than the wood building is that non-fireproof steel does very poorly when exposed to the high heat of fire. In any case, Rand Hall, the steel frame building, was perfectly capable of supporting a fine arts library on any of its three floors, both structurally as well as according to the latest fire safety stipulations in the New York State Building Code. But the fine arts library was not in Rand Hall. Instead, it was in Sibley Hall, where it was non-conforming. That is, it was there under an old building code, and it was allowed to remain there as a so-called grandfathered space, even though it would not have been compliant under modern codes, at least on the third floor. Actually, being on the second floor was fine. But then, in their infinite wisdom, Cornell connected Sibley Hall and Rand Hall with a third structure called Milstein Hall, designed with much fanfare by the architect Rem Koolhaas and his firm OMA. The combined building became a single building according to the building code, and its construction type, since there can only be a single construction type for a single building, was determined by its weakest link, the wood frame type 5B designation for Sibley Hall. But it's not like Milstein Hall's construction was that much better. In fact, it was exactly the same as Rand Hall, with a non-fireproofed steel frame, or what would have been type 2B construction had it been a freestanding building. As a single combined building, the new Sibley-Milstein-Rand concoction would have been totally non-compliant with any modern building code, since Milstein Hall's second floor area of 25,000 square feet all by itself exceeds the allowable area of 22,500 square feet for a type 5B building with assembly spaces. But it squeaked through, illegally in my view, based on an incoherent and idiosyncratic appendix in the 2002 New York State Building Code that didn't appear anywhere else in the country, and in fact was immediately removed when the next 2007 Building Code was adopted. Appendix K permitted additions to buildings to exceed the ordinary code limits as long as a fire barrier was installed between the new addition and the existing building. This is obviously incoherent, since no floor area limits were placed on such an addition. Under this code appendix, an infinitely large building of the least fire-resistant construction could be built as an addition to even a tiny shack, as long as a fire barrier separated them. In any case, the combined building was still considered as type 5B, or wood frame construction. Once Milstein Hall was completed, Cornell moved a temporary fine arts library from Sibley Hall into the third or top floor of Rand Hall, with many books being moved to the library annex. But this was clearly illegal, since a newer building code was already in effect, and that code, like the ones before and after, prohibited library occupancies on the third floor of a type 5B wood frame building. Cornell and the City of Ithaca Building Division somehow disagreed with this self-evident conclusion, and I was forced to challenge their code interpretation at a hearing of the New York State Division of Code Enforcement and Administration that took place in Syracuse in July of 2013. The hearing board ruling supported my complaint, and Cornell then had to do something about their now non-compliant library in Rand Hall. Cornell could have built a firewall between Milstein and Rand, so as to make Rand a separate building. Or they could have moved the Fine Arts Library to a compliant space somewhere else. Instead, they filed a building code variance request with the state of New York, asking that their library remain on the third floor and even have the possibility of expanding to the second floor of Rand Hall, which was also illegal under the current code. In spite of this, the variance request was granted by allowing increased floor area and increased height limits, but leaving the Type 5B construction type in place. So now we have a variance-enabled but otherwise illegal library on the third floor of Rand Hall. Soon the college raised money with an initial gift from Mui Ho to build a new library in the same space. But extending down to the second floor. Under the initial variance granted, this might have been okay, except that the 2015 New York State Code was now in effect, and the variance only applied to the 2010 code. But it gets worse. The architects for the Mui Ho Fine Arts Library decided to gut the existing building above the first floor and insert additional floors in the space above. Now, instead of a 3-story building with assembly occupancy, we have what amounted to a 5-story building with assembly occupancy. And this is clearly illegal under the building code. Even a library in a non-fireproofed steel frame building can only be 3 stories high. And Cornell therefore went back to the state of New York for a second variance in 2015, which was also granted. This second variance reformulated the open space of the library as an atrium with 2 stories and 2 mezzanines, and allowed 2-hour fire-rated fire barriers to separate Rand from Milstein Hall, instead of the more substantial fire walls that the code actually requires. Later, in 2016, Cornell applied for a third code variance, in which the penthouse spaces on the roof were eliminated and the floors in the atrium were reformulated as 3 stories with no mezzanines. So now, including the non-library space on the ground level, we have a 4-story building with a library on the top 3 floors, still violating the building code in terms of area and height, but now made legal through this third variance. But the drama is not yet over. Cornell has raised additional money to place a rooftop gallery over the library space, having fantasies of constructing pavilions there periodically, inspired by the geodesic dome built by students working with Buckminster Fuller in 1952. Unfortunately, this creates a 5-story building once pavilions, elevators, and bathrooms are constructed on the roof. To reiterate, without the code variances, assembly spaces can be no higher than 2 stories in the Type 5B construction that regulates the combined Sibley-Milstein-Rand Hall building. The initial code variance allowed a library on the 3rd floor, and the next 2 variants allowed a library on the 4th story. Would Cornell now go back for a 4th code variance, seeking to put new assembly occupancies on a 5th story? Well, no. Instead, they have proposed something so completely absurd that one can hardly believe it has been, at least provisionally, accepted by the City of Ithaca Building Division. They are claiming that the 5th story occupancies, including a large open roof gallery, a bulkhead with an elevator, stair, and bathrooms, and future enclosed pavilions, are all actually part of a mezzanine within the atrium space of the library. Let me quote exactly what the City of Ithaca Director of Code Enforcement wrote. Quote, "The rooftop gallery must meet the code requirements for a mezzanine, otherwise the building is non-compliant. I have discussed this issue with the design team several times and have been assured that it will be sized so that it does meet the code requirements for a mezzanine. The sizing of the rooftop area must include the permanently enclosed space at that level and all the open area that can be occupied. I do not believe that the code requires the mezzanine to be open to the atrium because the mezzanine has 2 exits." In response to this patently absurd contention, let me explain why the rooftop occupancies do not qualify as a mezzanine. First, the definition of a mezzanine in Chapter 2 of the 2015 Building Code states that a mezzanine is, quote, "an intermediate level or levels between the floor and ceiling of any story and in accordance with Section 505, end quote. Clearly, the open roof gallery is not between a floor and a ceiling of any space, since there is no ceiling above it. Therefore, it cannot be a mezzanine. Second, the definition of an atrium in Chapter 2 of the 2015 Building Code states that an atrium must be, quote, "closed at the top," end quote. Therefore, it is impossible to include an open-air roof gallery as part of an atrium, since the atrium in that case would not be closed at the top. Third, Section 505 of the Building Code states that a mezzanine must be in the room for which it is so designated, not on top of the room, as is the case with a roof gallery. Specifically, Section 505.2.1 states, quote, "The aggregate area of a mezzanine or mezzanines within a room shall be not greater than 1/3, which can be increased to 1/2 if you have sprinklers, of the floor area of that room or space in which they are located," end quote. This section twice reiterates that the mezzanine must be within or in the room or space. And this is not just a figure of speech, but it's deliberate and important. Mezzanines are allowed to bypass certain fire safety considerations because, unlike ordinary stories, they are in another room, where occupants of the mezzanine are more aware of any fires that might originate in that room. The mezzanine has what used to be called a common atmosphere with the room in which it is located, so greater awareness of smoke and fire is possible. Being in the room is therefore integral to the very essence of a mezzanine. Whether or not the opening between the mezzanine and the room it is in has been closed off according to code exceptions, the advantage of being in the room still applies. It is improper to ignore that part of the definition and just look at the requirements for maximum mezzanine area. If one used only the logic of maximum area, then any space, for example a third-floor office, could be considered a mezzanine of a larger second-floor space that happened to be below it, even if there were no logical connections between the two spaces, but only a vertical adjacency. Fourth, the idea that an atrium can have a mezzanine within it is a contradiction in terms, since atriums are just, quote, openings connecting two or more stories, end quote. Only a conventional room or space can have a mezzanine. An atrium is not a conventional room or space, but rather is defined as an opening adjacent to such rooms or spaces. Once mezzanine floor area is inserted into an atrium, that floor area is by definition no longer an opening between stories, and so it cannot be part of the atrium. Rather, it would be part of the adjacent stories that surround the atrium. The Director of Code Enforcement correctly states that the building would be non-compliant if the rooftop gallery, including all enclosed and occupied open spaces on the roof, does not qualify as a mezzanine. I think it is clear that the rooftop occupied spaces cannot be considered as a mezzanine. Therefore, the building is non-compliant. I can only hope that Cornell and all the other parties involved will reconsider this preliminary code interpretation, since this notion of a rooftop mezzanine cannot be logically sustained.